Hi and welcome to Marking the Role. Good to have you listening. Marking the Role is a podcast for teachers. We're based in the Illawarra area of Australia, but it's for teachers everywhere. And as we're slowly learning, it's for parents everywhere, because what happens in schools and universities directly affects the sons and daughters of parents. My name is Phil Dye. I'm your host. I'm an ex-teacher and I have an avid interest in education. I'd firstly like to thank some teachers, or maybe they're not teachers, I'm not sure who they are, parents who have become members of the podcast or have donated to the podcast. Sataran, thank you so much. Sophie S, you know Sophie, who you are. John B, Sophie F, thank you so much. Those people have become members of the podcast through the Buy Me a Coffee platform, and it only costs $5 to help support the podcast and pay the fees that we have to pay. This is entirely volunteer. No one gets paid for Marking the Role. Last week was episode 12, and we looked at the Year 12 exams. Now, for those listening from other countries, we have 12 to 13 years of formal education in Australia, and at the end of the 12th year there is normally an exam, although some states don't have one. Many do, most do, and we looked at whether it's still relevant in today's society. And from the teachers that I interviewed, and some of those teachers were also parents, from the students that I interviewed, it seems that it is not. It is old world. Only 40% of university entrants are due to this exam, and students just feel like it's out of date. Well, one of the reasons it's out of date is that they still have to use a pencil or pen and paper to write their extended answers. So I ask you, how long is it since you wrote a 1,000 word or 2,000 word essay by hand? We simply don't do it anymore. We have keyboards in order to help us edit. Now, writing is an essential skill. Handwriting is essential. I'm not saying that we should dump that at all. But a big reason that the Year 12 exams are out of date is that it's still handwritten. Another reason is that it's a summative mark. In other words, they look at this total mark at the end of the exam. It holds a lot of weight, whereas smaller formative tasks throughout the school life of a student is a better way of evaluating what a student has done. It makes sense, doesn't it? And another reason is that it seems that the Year 12 teachers are doing the work of a university. If the universities had exams to go into the different faculties, whether it's nursing, whether it's engineering, whether it's veterinary science, and not a long 4-hour exam like medicine, but something that's just an indication of the student's aptitude and personality. If their personality is suited, that would be a better measure. So all in all, the outcome is that the Year 12 exams are old world and should be dumped. This week, this is episode 13, we're looking at the rights of students. Now, the rights of students, there's many, many rights of students, and the rights of students equate and equal to the rights of other of human beings. Of course they do. But we're looking at particular rights. We're looking at the rights to be safe in a school environment. We're looking at the rights to privacy. We're looking at the rights of inclusion. And we're looking at the responsibilities that come with those rights. Rather than me interviewing just one person at a time, this episode involves a panel. Now, the panel was to be 4 people. We have a teacher from Queensland, Velma Cahill. We have a principal from New South Wales, Mark Smith. I was to have Dr. David Armstrong, the Senior Lecturer in Inclusion and Disability from RMIT, and he was booked. He was booked and confirmed, but didn't turn up for the panel interview. So we'll be talking to both Mark and Velma about certain rights. Sometimes the sound is a little bit fuzzy. Most of the time it's pretty good, so please forgive that. Here we go. the discussion on student rights and responsibilities. Okay, let's get straight to the point. We're looking at student rights and responsibilities, and whether rights, if it's even possible to acknowledge and go by those rights in this difficult education time that we've got. So is it possible, let's do inclusion first, is it possible to be inclusive of every student in a classroom where staff and resources are limited, like they are now? What do you think, Mark?
Look, I think the key to the answer there is in the second half of your sentence around the resources. Largely, I think unless there are a substantial uplift in the resources for mainstream schools, including all students with additional needs, is going to be highly problematic. Very difficult to achieve, where everybody has their own rights, whether they are with special needs or not, have their own rights protected in those circumstances.
What do you think, Velma?
I think that the word inclusive is bandied around a lot. A lot of students are put on NCCD.
And for those listeners not in Australia, the NCCD is the nationally consistent collection of data on school students with disability. So this collects all of the information about students with a disability in the country. Interestingly enough, and Velma goes into this later on, that there is no medical diagnosis required, no psychiatrist or psychologist diagnosis or report required. It can be simply what the parents think, what the student thinks, or perhaps what the teacher thinks.
A lot of students are put on NCCD that don't actually have a disability. We've just done our NCCD data upload, and 27% of our Year 7 to 9s are listed in that data set, and most of them are for social and emotional needs as opposed to actual disabilities. So if you're trying to cater for almost 30% of your students, it is quite difficult with the allocated model that we have.
Yes. And do many of those students have a specialist individual carer?
No. They've obviously got they don't even have to have a diagnosis to be on the NCCD. Just
Correct.
have to say they do, or their parents just have to say they do. And so, I don't have a problem with students with disabilities being on that list. However, I would prefer them to be verified in some way. So to have a paediatrician or a doctor or something say, this student has social and emotional needs that a teacher needs to cater for, but a parent can just say that their student does, or a teacher can say that this student does, without any supporting documentation required.
Is that your experience, Mark?
I think the schools have quite a hand in our situation, where we are a school that supports students with disabilities. We have quite a hand in determining that level of disability and their functionality within our schools. Most of our students will have some form of diagnosed condition.
But from my reading, when I was reading from the New South Wales Education Department site, it's not necessary to have a medical diagnosis. Is that true?
That's correct. So we're really looking at the functionality and the needs that are determined as a result of that those students with lesser functionality, if you like.
Yep. So in today's environment, when there's the resources are very thin on the ground, when staff are very thin on the ground, it's really impossible to guarantee that inclusive right of the student. But here's another question related to that. Does one student's right not to be suspended over and over again, for example, 3 suspensions in a row, you can't do that anymore. That student then goes back into the school, and some would say that that infringes on the other student's rights to safety. Do you think that that is the case, Mark?
It's not just the other students that are involved in this. There's a workforce. These are work sites, and staff. They themselves are put at risk. If I can digress with a little story, I was in an emergency ward last night in a major hospital in Wollongong, and a young fellow was acting out, swearing at staff, moving around in a threatening way. The staff gave him fair warning. They spoke to him fairly, calmly, and let him know that if that continued, security would be called. As that person continued, security was called. It did escalate, and the police were called, and the police assisted the staff at the hospital in managing this violent and aggressive behaviour. And that's in keeping with the policy for health staff in that hospital, that there is zero tolerance of violence and violent and aggressive behaviour directed at staff. Now, that person removed from a setting where there were 50 people in the waiting room, from babies to the elderly, their message was loud and clear. We don't accept that violence. We don't accept aggressive behaviour in our context, either for our patients or for ourselves. Sadly, that message is not the one that's given in schools. Sadly, that's not the message that schools are asked to give. So I correct myself on that. That's not the message that schools are asked to give around student behaviour. Right? There was, at the hospital last night, there was no roundtable discussion with that person and their carer. This was a firm and fair action to protect everybody in that situation. And I think what often gets overlooked in the promotion of the individual rights of a student is the fact that we are members of a community that does have boundaries around the sorts of behaviour that can be expected from each of us, and other people can be affected by that behaviour, and their safety can be seriously affected. And schools have an obligation to every student, not just the students whose rights can be perceived to be breached by a form of discipline that keeps other people safe.
So you're really saying that with those rights come responsibilities, and the responsibility is to act within the law.
Look, I think that the employers of the teachers have responsibilities to the safety of its workforce. That needs to be a priority in the face of whatever rights might exist, and it's very hard to determine. It's not a straight line, Phil. There's no clear response to what safety looks like. But we have the community example of what happens with smoking in restaurants. The community expectation these days is that people don't smoke in restaurants. Now, when a restaurant puts up a sign that says no smoking, they're not breaching that individual person's rights. They can go and smoke, and they have a right to smoke, but not here. The reason that sanction is accepted is that because it balances the rights of that smoker with the rights of everybody else not to be exposed to the smoke. It's an analogy that can only go so far, but it is an analogy that can also work around violence in schools.
Valma, have you experienced, or do you know anyone who's experienced something similar with violence in the school situation?
Yes, Phil. I've been the victim of a assault by students, and there have been other staff at our school that have been assaulted by students. One of the meetings that I went to, a staff meeting that I went to, like the principal asked for our feedback on certain issues, and my point was I would like other staff, to be aware of violent students. So, you might have that student in your class and she's been excluded from me teaching her, but the other teachers may not know her violent streak, and therefore, like I said, the staff don't need to know who has been assaulted, but surely they need to know who they were assaulted by. I was told that the privacy of the student was paramount, and that information would not be passed on to other staff. And my point then was, so the rights of the staff to remain safe in their workplace was secondary to the right of the privacy of the child.
I think that principal may find themselves in breach of occupational health and safety regulations there, because in our settings, in particular, the safety, if there are risks associated with student behaviour, that will trump the need for privacy around that student behaviour.
That's very interesting. So, Valma, in the example that you just mentioned, what about the casual teachers that come in? Will a casual teacher be warned of a certain student, or does that fall under the privacy guidelines of your school?
No, no one would be aware. But so
right.
The principal said, how would you feel if it was your child that every teacher in the school knew that they had assaulted someone? And I said, well, I would expect that every teacher in my child's school would know if my child assaulted someone, so that they can take measures to ensure that when they're on playground duty, they keep 2 meters apart instead of, be closer. Or if they get a supervision for a class that child is in, that they can take avoidance behaviour to make sure that doesn't escalate to a point where that student would lash out. I was told that once the national collection of data had gone onto one school and stuff, that it would be easier for us to access. But it also means that you have to look through every student's one school reports to find that data out.
Right. Yeah. And that's a major research operation, I'd imagine.
Well, yeah, it's, at the beginning of each year, a teacher will download dashboard and find out, what the student's profile is, but they don't go back and read every one school report that's ever been written on about a particular student's behaviour. That would, you talk about workload creep, there it is.
Yep.
So you go on the dashboard that you have, and there's nothing a student's profile will have a little red cross if they've got a medical issue, but there's nothing to say whether they've got a behavioural issue.
You're listening to Marking the Role, a podcast for teachers and anyone interested in education. We discuss the real issues facing educators without fear or favour. Please follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our podcast and tell your friends. For more info, go to markingtherole.com.au.
So, Mark, getting back to what you were saying, that is an occupational health and safety breach on behalf of the principal.
I feel I don't know the principal. I don't know the context of the school, so I'm reluctant to say more than that it's an interesting decision, and it's not one that we would make in our school. I suppose we go for a bigger picture of trust of staff. We're sharing information that's important for them to keep safe, but also to have them prepared in case there's incidents, so they're not responding in a shock form. They're aware that these students can present, there's not a label. That's preparation for what may happen. They're aware that these behaviours can happen, and they can therefore be prepared, and they're able to enact the training that's provided to them through our school and through which the system should be providing that support. Sadly, there is an attitude of teachers where they do take this deficit model that teachers don't have the skills. They can't be trusted, so we can't share this information because they will abuse the information. I suppose I would be encouraging schools to say, let's trust our staff. Let's know that this information is important to keep everybody safe, not just themselves, but everybody in the school. And the argument that was presented to Valma around as a reason for not sharing the information, one would like to think that as a professional, you're not guilted into a sense of compliance.
Right. Look, while we're still on that issue of student privacy, what does a school have to tell a parent? So if the recent case in America where the Year 8 boy wanted to socially transition from being male to female. He told the school counsellor. The school understood perfectly well all about it. But the parents didn't find out for 6 months after the process had begun. So the school was very supportive of the boy and helping him, but the parents didn't know about it till 6 months later. Is that the sort of thing that could happen in an Australian school?
I think it depends on the age of the student. I think just as there's the terminology around dolly incapacts, where the police or the system will, the justice system will decide whether a student is capable of knowing the difference between right and wrong in the ages between 10 and 14. I think there's so many factors in this. How do we determine the student's ability to make fair and reasonable decisions for themselves that don't need to be passed on to other people? I think students at the age of either 14 or 15 can get a Medicare card, and I think that's where the system has given some sort of threshold to autonomy, if you like. However, if this was through a school where, say, a student had some gender issues and approached a staff member without a scheduled, meeting or plan for support over a long period of time, if they have just approached a staff member, and it could be a counsellor, it could be a welfare teacher, it could be anyone that they trust, the response of staff is to be supportive. That's what it is. And if they hear, and we're driven by a code, we're guided by a code of conduct that informs our practice, and part of that is keeping people safe. So if we are informed of things that would breach child protection issues, for instance, it's mandated that we report. If we're informed of something that allows us to understand the student is at risk, we're also obliged to pass that on. And if I can also make the point that when students approach staff with a concern, whether it's bullying or perhaps even gender issues, there is an understanding that the staff will pass that on. Now, the situation in America, however, it sounds like it was a consistent, perhaps even scheduled intervention over a long period of time. My belief is that the school should have engaged the family. And it is interesting that through that whole period, the family didn't come up as an issue for the student in a way that meant that the family would need to be engaged. There's a lot more we don't know about that.
Yeah.
I mean, we also don't know why Wyoming bans Bluey's fart jokes, but still allows people to carry guns and students to be exposed at the risks of weaponry in school.
Valma, what do you think of that privacy issue? I mean, would you, if it was your son, would you have wanted to be, informed and brought into the conversation?
I am unaware of the actual case, apart from just hearing from you. But I'm surprised that the student hadn't discussed these issues with their own parents to start with. It is very unlikely in my history for a student to approach the counsellors and stuff without discussing that sort of stuff with their parents first.
Yeah, you would think that would be a major point of conversation, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more to it than we might know.
Yeah. Usually students will discuss that sort of stuff with their peers first, sound out how their peers will accept them before they disclose to their parents. But they very rarely disclose to other adults before they've disclosed to their someone like at home that they trust.
Yep. While on that same issue of the transgender, there is some discussion. I've been asked this on email. does someone who's transitioning, can they go into the bathroom of the gender that they're transitioning to when they haven't fully transitioned? Whoever thought we'd be having this discussion? But, what does the department say about that, Mark?
Well, no, they can't, and that's not a choice they make. It's left as a responsibility for us to provide a safe toileting facilities for all students. Unlike a school recently that complained to their principal when they constantly were being caught vaping in the toilets, the students complained to the principal saying, "Well, why did you put a toilet in our vaping room?"
No.
So I'd love to hear the response to that. But look, I think as time brings change around gender identity, we have to move with that around how we provide toileting facilities for all of our students.
But so at the moment, though, they can't just go in.
There's an assumption that boys who go into a boys' toilet in a state high school or any high school are safe. There's an assumption that girls who go into a girls' toilet area are also safe. That's not always the case. We may move towards a model where they're individual cubicles, where they are, where they're not gender specific.
I attended a conference at a state school in Brisbane last year, and the toilets were all unisex. So my girlfriend and I went into the toilets, and we were having a conversation as women do when they're in the bathroom. And a man voice comes over the wall saying, "I always wanted to know what women talked about in here."
Oh dear. Yes, that seems to be the way it's going. Well, on that lavatory note, I think it's time for a brain break. A brain break is where we take the electricity in our brain down by listening to some music. And this time, our brain break is from Gregory Paul Manif. Now, Gregory is a musician, a composer, a pianist from the Illawarra. You can find him on Spotify. It's a very relaxing style of music, beautiful to listen to before you go to bed. And here is his tune, Lily and Luna. And that beautiful piece was called Lily and Luna by Gregory Paul Manif, a musician, a composer, wonderful pianist from the Illawarra, and you can find his music anywhere. You get your music, it's certainly out on Spotify.
This episode of Marking the Roll is brought to you by Coolangatta Estate Winery. Coolangatta Estate is on Bowlong Road near Berry, about 50 minutes south of Wollongong, and is the region's most awarded winery and hospitality venue. The cellar door is open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. daily. Just Google Coolangatta Estate for information.
And thanks to Coolangatta Estate for that sponsorship. I was a bit surprised when I heard of it, and I thought, geez, I know teachers like a drink, but I realised that teachers also have Christmas parties, and it's the ideal venue down near Berry, just in the northern Shoalhaven, the southern Illawarra, for staff Christmas parties. We're now going to continue the panel discussion on student rights with Mark Smith, the principal of Lamandra School in Sydney, and Velma Cahill, teacher from Queensland. And we'll begin this next part with a tricky discussion on challenging ideas. And another issue that's been quite big in the UK, and it's been mainly in universities, but it's gone into high schools as well, is that students are complaining about teachers who present challenging ideas. When there's a topic, let's just say they're looking at the First World War, and they're looking at the history of the First World War and the 15 years that led up to that, and eugenics was a big movement. But in the UK, some students have banded to say that they are offended by even hearing about that eugenics. Can we do, I mean, is that possible? Can a student complain about actual content? Mark, have you had that experience?
No, I haven't, Phil, but I suppose they can complain about anything they like.
Well, the vaping room.
They like the vaping room, yeah. That's a disturbing trend towards narrowness, I'm afraid. And I don't think as an educationalist, as a teacher, where the ethos of teaching is based on risk-taking, where we can condone taking away the risk of new knowledge, new understandings, exposure to things that challenge us. That's not called teaching.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I did have a parent contact me last week about teaching evolution in the Year 10 science curriculum because it wasn't something that they believe or instruct their own child on. And they asked me for an alternative assessment task, to which I replied, it's part of the Australian curriculum. I don't ask for an opinion or your point of view. It is literally like teaching the evidence behind the theory of evolution. And to which the parent then agreed that their child would sit that piece of assessment.
At the end of the day, Velma, it's just information. Phil,
that's right.
Phil, it's not a new thing in a sense. Teaching back in the 80s and teaching senior English using a fabulous novel by the name of Jono. There's a critical point in the middle of the novel where one character writes a letter to the other and uses the F word. Now, it's a critical letter, and that formed the basis of a Year 11 exam for us, for myself and other teachers. We put it together. Now, so the exam paper carried the F word, just as the Australian novel approved by the Department of Education did. The first we heard of the issue was when we got a call from the principal on the morning that this was to be published in the Sydney papers, just to remind us that our jobs weren't under threat.
Very reassuring.
Very reassuring. But we were certainly called in to explain why we would choose to use that particular element of the story for a Year 11 exam, a discussion easily won by us. However, that question didn't appear in the exam paper, and 50 copies of Jono sat in the storeroom, never to be used again.
Oh,
I often tell my students it's not my job to teach you what to think, it's my job to teach you how to think. But how to take that information and make it your own. Because they are only under our guardianship for, a few short years, and then they go out into the real world and they need to form their own opinions and their own, take the facts and turn them into their own belief system. And it is our job not to teach them what to think, but how to take that information and make it their own thoughts and words.
Exactly right. Well said, Velma. In the scenario in the UK, it was because a group of students felt unsafe talking about it, thinking that other students may pick up and say, this is not a bad idea, this theory. So there was a thing of safety. So that's what they confronted the headmaster about.
What particular form of safety were they talking about?
I'm just thinking back, it was on the unheard side. It was about they felt threatened during the discussion. Evidently, the discussion got quite animated. And, at university and senior high school, that's what you want. You want, discussions that are pretty solid. And they felt unsafe about that discussion.
Well, I'm glad Western democracy didn't hinge on the outcome of that discussion.
That's right. Now, look, we're nearly at the end. Can you think of any other issues to do with student rights, or any policies of behaviour, perhaps restraint, inclusion, that you see could raise issues for teachers in Australian schools? Is there anything that comes to mind, Velma or Mark?
Well, we had training the other day on restrictive practices, and when you normally think of restrictive practices, you generally think of holding or restraining a child, but we were told that keeping one in detention is now a restrictive practice and also banned under the rights of the child. So even the point of students who are non-compliant, repeatedly non-compliant, the department has removed 40-minute detentions from our list of strategies for restoring that.
Right. What about if it's a 20-minute kept in at recess to finish some work?
No, if the student's not allowed to leave, or they think they're not allowed to leave, then that is classified as restrictive practice.
So they only have to think they're not allowed to leave.
That's correct.
They feel restricted, so you are restricted. That's what they're saying.
That's what the department. We had a whole 2-hour PD on it.
Mark, what's your view on this?
Look, I'm so happy that we have a restrictive practices on trains that doesn't allow me to get off the train between stations. So pleased that we've got doors that automatically open at the station. Do I feel my rights are breached in that moment? No. And Velma, lovely to see that Queensland and New South Wales are in sync as the pendulum swings all the way in the direction of individual rights. Hopefully it will swing back, but we're dealing with the same ideology, the same ideological changes around where the balance of rights sits, and it is certainly with the individual and not with the collective, not with the community, not with the other students or the staff in the school, but with the individual. Will that make places more equal? I doubt it. Will that make them more safe? Absolutely not. We've now moved to a stage where we are looking at employing security guards. Mind you, they won't have jackboots or lightning bolts on their shirts, but we still need a level of support that the department is no longer willing to support its staff having the training in. So I know I'm as one principal I'm making this call. I'm sure I won't be the last where schools regard this trend towards individual rights is also a trend towards getting the form of support that will keep people safe, staff and other students.
Wow. Velma, any idea of security guards at your school?
Well, Queensland are in the process of putting 6-foot high barbed fences around all its schools. So our school is like a prison. At 9:00, the gates are all locked. and at 5 to 3 they're unlocked, and so students can't wag and go to the local park to vape anymore. They have to do it at school because they can't get in or out.
That sounds like a horrible conflagration of individual rights here, Velma.
Yeah, everyone, even the teachers could say that their rights are being infringed.
Yeah, we can't get out unless you get out and unlock the gate. So,
yeah. I suppose you could say a staff meeting is a form of restraint on the teachers.
Practice on the teachers.
Yeah,
and I'm guessing that attendance to lessons will become voluntary.
Oh dear. Anything, that's a good addition, Valma. Anything else that comes to mind, Mark?
Look, there is a push for inclusion within our state, absolutely. And there are many cases where students with additional needs or disabilities can be included in mainstream regular classes. There's no doubt about that. Even at that level where students can be easily accessed with the physical reconstruction of a room or a building or a stairway or whatever, they're easy and they should be done. And our students should have access to the full suite of learning within the mainstream setting. However, there will be students with a range of disabilities that need something more than what a mainstream setting can offer. That the system provides a whole suite of different sorts of educational facilities that allows the students with particular needs to have their educational needs met as well as their other support needs. I think it's a fiction to believe, an ideological fiction to believe that they can all be included within the one setting and that this will work for everyone. It won't, not even in the most highly resourced schools. There will still be a risk that the education that's provided there is not suitable for all students. I know my setting, students with a mental health condition or with serious challenging behaviours, I know the setting is one that provides a form of education that meets their needs. And to make that point, the schools around New South Wales, similar to mine, are about to launch on getting parent feedback on whether they believe that their students are best suited in schools specifically designed to cater for their sons and daughters, or whether their educational needs, welfare needs, wellbeing needs are best suited in a mainstream setting. I look forward to those findings, Phil, because yes. I know the findings that the department is using to validate, part of the findings they're using to validate the move towards inclusion has a very small sample size. And I don't, whilst the students with disabilities is a very broad term, I would be very interested to see from which areas of disabilities the predominant responders to their research, which areas of disability they actually come from.
And it was interesting, Mark, that I read all that research, and there is a phrase or a sentence buried away that says several of the respondents answered the questionnaire twice.
Phil, in keeping with that, the preamble of one of the articles sent to me to read around the validation of this policy, the preamble says, we will be looking at all of the research that shows that inclusion models work.
And as Mark said, if you only look at the research that reinforces your ideology, well, that's the outcome that you're going to come up with, isn't it? And what's the use of doing any so-called research? It's like only interviewing Liberal voters for an election poll, and therefore it comes out that, yes, the Liberal Party are going to win. You were listening to Mark Smith, the principal of Lamandra School. You were listening to Valma Cahill, teacher from Queensland. And this is not the last of the panel discussions that we'll have on various issues. Just reminding you, I did invite Dr. David Armstrong, the senior lecturer on inclusion and disability from RMIT, and he was to present an alternative viewpoint, but he didn't turn up to the discussion. And I'm going to conclude this topic with the idea that it seems that too many inside educational bureaucracies are more focused on validating a certain ideology instead of looking at what is best for its students. In today's world, not only in Australia but all over the world, in schools and universities, ideology trumps what is best for students. You've been listening to Marking the Roll. Marking the Roll is a non-for-profit. No one is paid here at Marking the Roll. And if you'd like to help us to exist and help pay some of our platform fees, you can go to markingtheroll.com.au and go to buy us a coffee. And if you can buy us a coffee for $5, that'll help us along. Or you can become a member of the podcast, and membership gives you quite a few lurks and perks. My name's Phil Dye, and next week we are on teacher professional development, and we'll be discussing that because that comes in for a lot of flack from teachers all over the country. I'm not sure about internationally, but teachers are saying that the mandated professional development is boring. See you next week.